The wind was a liar on the scorched plains, whispering of cool water, where there was only dust and brittle sun-bleached bone. Reed Callahan had learned not to trust it years ago. He trusted the acrid scent of smoke that clung to the air, a scent that had pulled him from his ranch before dawn. He trusted the distant popping echoes he'd heard an hour past, like a string of firecrackers set off in a canyon, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. He crested a low ridge, his horse-buster snorting nervously beneath him. The sight that met his eyes was a familiar sickness in his gut. Down in a shallow basin, where a creek had once offered life before the sun hammered it into a cracked, brittle mirror, lay the smoldering ruins of a small Apache encampment. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The canvas of the wickiups was shredded, and blackened belongings were strewn across the terracotta dust and the bodies. The bodies lay where they had fallen, twisted and still. This was not the work of the army. Their attacks were brutal but methodical. This was the chaotic, greedy violence of land-grabbers' men who saw the land and its people as nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared. Reed dismounted his Winchester rifle, held low, his eyes scanning the ruin. A profound weariness settled over him, heavier than the oppressive heat. He had left the blue uniform behind to escape this very thing, to find a sliver of peace in a world determined to tear itself apart. He had built his ranch as a bulwark against the past, a quiet monument to a life he'd lost. Yet the past had a long reach. He moved through the quiet devastation, his boots crunching on scorched earth. He saw the tracks shod horses, at least a dozen of them, their prints gouged deep into the ground. Men in a hurry. He knelt beside the still form of an old man, his face turned toward the merciless sky, and gently closed his eyes. It was a futile gesture, a prayer for a man whose gods he did not know, but it was all he could offer. A flicker of movement near the dry creek bed caught his eye. It was nothing more than a shadow shifting against stone, but in the dead stillness, it was a shout. He raised the Winchester, his thumb resting on the hammer, and approached with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew that survival was a game of inches. "Come out," he said, his voice a low rasp, rough from dust and disuse. "I mean you no harm." Silence answered him. The wind moaned through the skeletal remains of a wickiup. Reed took another step, his eyes fixed on the deep shadows beneath an overhang. He saw them then huddled together in the narrow channel of the creek bed, their forms cloaked in dust and despair. 3 women. One held a broken spear haft like a club, her knuckles white. Another, younger, stared with eyes so wide they seemed to hold all the horror of the morning. The 3rd woman, and the one in the center, met his gaze. Her face was a mask of grime and dried blood, but her eyes were sharp as flint, burning with a fire that refused to be extinguished. She was clutching something small and metallic in her hand, holding it tight against her chest as if it were the last piece of her soul. "We have no weapons for you to take," she said, her voice strained but steady. Reed slowly lowered his rifle. He wasn't looking at her face anymore. His gaze was locked on the object in her fist. It was a small silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging from a frayed leather cord. The sun caught the intricate etching on its surface, a single soaring hawk. The world seemed to fall away. The heat, the smell of death, and the rifle in his hands, it all vanished, replaced by a memory so sharp it was a physical pain. He saw a young woman with a bright, easy laugh, her hair the color of spun corn husks, placing that same locket around the neck of her friend, an Apache girl named Tona. "So you'll never forget the sky is yours to fly in," she'd said. The young woman was his wife Clara, years before sickness had stolen her from him. And Tona was the childhood friend Clara had tried to protect, the one whose family had been driven from their lands in a government relocation that Reed, then a young, naive soldier, had been powerless to stop. had failed them both. He took a shaky breath, the air searing his lungs. He looked from the locket back to the woman's face, truly seeing her for the first time. The fierce set of her jaw, the defiant angle of her chin. He saw Tona in her eyes. "My name is Reed Callahan," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its harsh edge. "I'm not here to hurt you. I came because of the gunfire." The woman with the spear, her body taut as a bowstring, spoke with venom. "The gunfire is over. The vultures have flown. Leave us." But the woman with the locket held up a hand to silence her. She studied Reed's face, her gaze piercing, searching for the lie. "Why are you looking at this?" she asked, her knuckles still white around the locket. Reed's throat was tight. "It belonged to a friend," he managed to say. "A friend of my wife's." The admission hung in the dead air, a fragile bridge between two worlds of grief. The woman's fierce expression flickered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then a deep, resonant sorrow. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving only the bone-deep exhaustion of a survivor. "Her name was Tona," the woman said quietly. "She was my mother." The words struck Reed like a physical blow. This was not just a reminder of his past failure, it was its living, breathing consequence. The world had brought the daughter of the woman he couldn't save to his feet amidst the ashes of her life. He could turn and walk away back to his isolated ranch, back to the quiet ghosts he knew. Or he could face this one. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, a clear gesture of peace. "The men who did this will be back," he said, his voice gaining a new resolve. "Or the buzzards will come. My ranch is half a day's ride from here. There's water, food, a place to rest." The suspicious woman, Nolly, scoffed. "And what is your price, soldier?" Reed looked at the woman with the locket at Sion. He looked at the ghosts of Clara and Tona standing beside her. "There is no price," he said. "Let's just call it a debt being paid." He extended a hand, not to help her up, but as an offering. After a long, silent moment, Sion nodded. With a groan of pain, she and the other two women, Noli and the young Tala, rose from the dust of the creek bed and prepared to follow him, three solitary figures stepping out of the ruins of one life and into the vast, uncertain expanse of another. The journey back to the ranch was a silent, grueling procession through an endless expanse of terracotta dust where the sun hammered the earth into a cracked, brittle mirror. Reed led the way, the three women trailing behind their movements, stiff with exhaustion and grief. He had given them what little water remained in his canteen, and now a thirst of his own clawed at his throat, but it was nothing compared to the desert of memory he was now traversing. Every rock and twisted mesquite seemed to whisper of Clara. He had brought her here to this harsh, beautiful land, promising her a life of peace, away from the rigid strictures of the East and the bloody mandates of the army he had come to despise. They had built the small cabin with their own hands, every log and stone a testament to their shared dream. But the land that had promised them freedom had also been unforgiving. The fever that took her had been as swift and brutal as any ambush, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her laughter in the empty rooms and the crushing weight of his own solitude. Now 3 more ghosts were following him home. He glanced back at them. Sion walked with the leaders, bearing her back straight, despite the visible pain from a deep gash on her arm. Nolly's eyes were constantly moving, scanning the horizon, her hand never far from the broken spear she had refused to discard. Tala, the youngest, walked with her head down, a small lost shadow in the vast landscape. He saw in them not just victims, but warriors who had lost their war. As they drew closer to the town of Redemption, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings shimmering in the heat haze, Reed steered them on a wide arc around it. The last thing they needed was to be seen. Redemption was a town living on a knife's edge, caught in the tightening grip of one man, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood had arrived 2 years ago, a man wrapped in charisma and tailored suits, with a voice as smooth as polished river stone, and eyes as cold as a winter night. He called himself a cattle baron, a purveyor of progress, but Reed knew a predator when he saw one. Blackwood had systematically begun to devour the valley, buying up struggling ranches for pennies on the dollar, and more importantly, seizing control of the water rights. The creeks and wells that had sustained families for generations were now his property. Those who refused to sell found their fences cut, their cattle mysteriously sickened, their wells running dry. Fear was the currency Blackwood traded in, and redemption was deep in his debt. Reed had to risk a trip into town for supplies. Leaving the women hidden in a rocky alcove a mile out, he rode in his hat pulled low. The air in Redemption was thick with a quiet tension. He saw Blackwood's men everywhere, hard-faced gunslingers with a proprietary swagger, their hands always hovering near their holsters. In the general store, he bought bandages, antiseptic, and enough food to last a week. He listened as he waited. "Heard Blackwood's offering old man hemlock next to nothing for his spread," the storekeeper whispered to another customer, the one with the spring. "Hemlock won't sell," the customer muttered back, not meeting the man's eyes. "His family's been there 50 years. "He will," the storekeeper said with grim finality. "They all do one way or another." The words confirmed the cold dread in Reed's gut. The massacre at the encampment wasn't random. It was a clearing of the board. Blackwood was consolidating his empire, and anyone settler or Apache who stood on land he desired was an inconvenience to be removed. As Reed tied the supply bags to his saddle, he saw Blackwood himself emerge from the saloon, flanked by 2 of his men. Blackwood was impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the town. He smiled, a flash of white teeth in a tanned, handsome face, but the smile never reached his eyes. His gaze swept over the street, not seeing people, but assets and liabilities. For a brief moment, his eyes met Reed's. There was no recognition, just a cold, dismissive assessment. But Reed felt a chill run down his spine, a primal instinct that told him this man was the source of the shadow falling over the valley. He rode out of town, the quiet conversations echoing in his mind. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was a man inviting a war to his doorstep. When he reached the women, he handed a water skin to Sayan without a word. She took it, her eyes questioning his grim expression. He didn't explain. Not yet. There would be time for words later. For now, there was only the journey home, a short ride into the heart of a conflict he now realized he could not avoid. His ranch came into view as the sun began its descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the land. The cabin was small, sturdy, a lonely sentinel on a low hill overlooking a modest pasture and a struggling cornfield. To Reed, it was the whole world. As he pushed open the gate, he felt a profound sense of trespass, not from the women behind him, but from the world he had just left behind in town. He was bringing the fight he had run from all those years ago right into the heart of his sanctuary. Inside the cabin was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and a single bed was tucked into a corner. It was the space of a man who expected no company. He laid the medical supplies on the table. "Clean your wounds," he said, his voice flat. "There's stew in the pot from yesterday. The loft is empty. You can sleep there." He expected suspicion, maybe another challenge from Nolly. Instead, he was met with a silence born of pure animal weariness. Tala sank onto a chair, her small frame seeming to fold in on itself. Nolly leaned her spear against the wall and immediately went to the water barrel, splashing her face with a ferocity that was almost violent. Sayan, however, approached the table. She picked up the antiseptic, her gaze fixed on Reed. This is a great risk for you. She stated, her voice low and measured, filled with the authority of a leader even in defeat. Her words were not a question, but a quiet acknowledgement of the storm he was inviting. Before Reed could answer, Noli turned from the water barrel, her face dripping, her eyes blazing with a pragmatic fire. "Why help us, soldier?" she asked, her tone sharp, challenging. "Is this your penance for the uniforms you once wore? A guilty conscience needing to be scrubbed clean?" The word soldier struck a nerve, but Reed kept his expression impassive. "I'm not a soldier anymore," he said. "And my conscience is my own business. You needed help, that's all." "That is never all," Nolly shot back. "Nolly, enough," Cyan commanded, her voice soft but unbreakable. She turned her gaze back to Reed. It held a deep well of grief, but also an unyielding strength. "We did not ask for your pity. We ask only for a chance to fight back." Her words resonated with a part of him he thought had died with Clara. The part that believed in standing for something more than just his own survival. As if summoned by the rising tension, the sound of an approaching horse cut through the evening air. All four of them froze. Reed grabbed his Winchester from its pegs by the door, his movements fluid and economical. He motioned for the women to move out of sight into the shadows near the hearth. A lone rider stopped at the gate. He didn't dismount immediately, but sat in his saddle surveying the ranch with an air of casual ownership. He was a tall man with a long duster and a slick, confident smile that didn't sit right. Reed recognized him as one of Blackwood's top men, a hired gun named Jedediah Kane. Reed stepped onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hand. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice even. Kane's smile widened. "Evening, Callahan. Just making some friendly rounds. Mr. Blackwood likes to know his neighbors are doing all right." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with a sound that was both cheerful and menacing. He sauntered toward the porch, his eyes flicking from Reed to the cabin and back again. "Heard some commotion out east this morning. Thought I'd check you hadn't run into any trouble. Vagrants, you know. Can't be too careful." The veiled threat was as clear as a gunshot. "No trouble here?" Reed said, not moving a muscle. "Just me." Kane leaned against a porch post, hooking his thumbs in his belt. His gaze was sharp, probing. "That's a shame. Because we found some tracks heading this way. 3 sets, small feet. Looked like they were in a powerful hurry." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Now Mr. Blackwood, he's a generous man. But he's got a real strong opinion about folks who harbor fugitives. Stirs up trouble for everyone. You understand. It was the formal declaration of war delivered with a smile. The central conflict was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It was standing on his porch. Reed's grip on the Winchester tightened almost imperceptibly. He met Kane's slick, knowing gaze with a look as hard and unyielding as the rocky soil beneath their feet. "The only thing I understand," Reed said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is that this is my land, and you're not welcome on it. Get back on your horse and ride out." Kane's smile finally vanished, replaced by a flash of cold fury. He held Reed's gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought in the dying light. Then with a sneer, he pushed himself off the post. "Have it your way, Callahan," he spat. "But don't say you weren't warned." He mounted his horse, wheeled it around, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. The inciting incident was over. Reed knew with absolute certainty that Kane would be back, and he wouldn't be coming for a friendly chat. He had drawn his line in the sand. Now he and the 3 women inside his cabin would have to defend it. The night that followed was thick with unspoken tension. But the immediate threat had forged a fragile, unspoken truce. In the morning, the 4 of them moved, with a shared grim purpose. There was no discussion, only action. Their first obstacle arrived sooner than expected. In the dead of night, 2 of Blackwood's men tried to set fire to the barn, a dry run test. But Nolly, sleeping with the instincts of a hunted animal, heard the snap of a dry twig and gave a low whistle. The attempt was clumsy, designed to scare more than destroy. Reed fired a single warning shot from the porch, sending the men scrambling back into the darkness like startled coyotes. The failed attack did not break them. It hardened their resolve. In the days that followed, the ranch transformed. It became less of a home and more of a fortress, built not just of wood and stone, but of a burgeoning, desperate alliance. The rising action was not a crescendo of violence, but the quiet, methodical work of preparation. They fortified the homestead, their shared labor, a silent conversation. Reed, his face set in grim lines, taught them the brutal geometry of defense, showing them how to create firing lines from the cabin windows, and how to use the terrain to their advantage. This shared purpose began to break down the walls between them. One afternoon, while reinforcing the corral fence, Reed found Sion struggling to aim his heavy Winchester. He took an old army revolver from his footlocker, its metal worn smooth with use, and brought it to her. "Lighter," he said, placing it in her hand. "Easier to handle. You aim just past the sight, it pulls a little to the left." He stood behind her, his hand gently guiding hers to correct her stance. He could feel the tension in her shoulders and the rigid control she held over herself. He demonstrated how to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dust a foot from the tin can they'd set on a fence post. Her second was closer. The third struck it dead center with a satisfying clang. A rare, fleeting smile touched her lips, and in that moment, Reed saw not just the warrior, but the woman beneath. In return, she taught him things his army training had never covered. One morning, she took him to the edge of his property and showed him how to read the land. The soldiers, they look for tracks, she explained, her voice a low murmur. They see with their eyes. You must learn to see with your feet. Feel the ground. A broken branch, a stone overturned. A blade of grass that leans the wrong way. The land always tells the truth. She showed him a tracking technique, a way of moving through the brush that was so silent, so in tune with the rhythm of the wild, that it felt like becoming part of the landscape itself. It was a transfer of knowledge, an exchange of trust that went deeper than words. Nolly, her fiery suspicion slowly banking into a grudging respect, proved to have a brilliant mind for mechanics and traps. She took the rusted gears from a broken water pump and fashioned them into a crude but effective warning system of wires and chimes. Tala, the quiet observer, began to emerge from her shell of trauma. She had an artist's eye for detail, noticing things the others missed: a loose board on the barn roof, the faint trail of a fox near the chicken coop. Her silence was not emptiness, but a deep, watchful intelligence. But fortification was not enough. Reed knew he had to understand his enemy. He rode into redemption this time, not for supplies, but for information. He went to the county clerk's office, a dusty, neglected room managed by a man named Elias Thorne, a frail, elderly man with spectacles thick as bottle glass, who had been in his post since before redemption was even a town. Callahan Elias wheezed, looking up from a massive ledger. "Don't see you much." "I need to see the land deeds for the valley," Elias Reed said, keeping his voice low. "Specifically anything bought by Silas Blackwood in the last 2 years. Elias's rheumy eyes widened in fear. I can't do that, Reed. Mr. Blackwood's business is private." Reed leaned on the counter, his presence filling the small room. "Men are dying, Elias. Ranches are being stolen. How long are you going to hide behind your books while he strangles this town?" The old man withered under his gaze. With trembling hands, he unlocked a filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of deeds. As Reed pored over them, a pattern of blatant fraud emerged. Signatures were forged, boundaries were misdrawn, and water rights claims were layered over existing ones with audacious disregard for the law. Blackwood wasn't buying the valley. He was stealing it with paper and ink. "This is all illegal," Reed breathed, a cold anger building inside him. "He has the judge in his pocket," Elias whispered, "and the sheriff is too scared to act. There's no one to report it to." As he was about to leave, Reed noticed a dusty, forgotten crate in the corner, stenciled with the insignia of the U.S. Army. "What's this?" "Oh, that's just old records from the Fort Verde campaign," Elias said dismissively. "Been sitting there for years. The Army abandoned them when they decommissioned the outpost." The Fort Verde campaign. A jolt went through Reed. He had been there. A young idealistic lieutenant in a brutal, pointless war. On a hunch, he pried open the crate. Inside were moldering files, requisitions, and soldiers' effects. His fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound book. It was a journal, its pages warped and stained by water and time. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, disciplined. It was the journal of a sergeant, a man who documented the daily life of their company. As he flipped through the pages, a familiar name caught his eye: Captain Silas Blackwood. Reed's blood ran cold. He read the entry, his heart pounding against his ribs. It described an officer known for his ambition and his cruelty, a man who saw the Apache not as people, but as pests. The first clue. The first thread connecting the charismatic cattle baron to Reed's own blood-soaked past. He tucked the journal into his saddlebag, a sense of deep unease settling over him. The fight was becoming more personal than he could have ever imagined. He was no longer just defending his land. He was confronting a ghost from a war he thought he had left behind. Back at the ranch, under the flickering light of an oil lamp, Reed spent the night poring over the water-damaged journal. The sergeant's words painted a vivid picture of Captain Silas Blackwood, a man driven by a ravenous hunger for glory, utterly contemptuous of the official rules of engagement. The entries detailed minor atrocities, unsanctioned raids, and a callous disregard for the lives of his own men. It was a history Reed remembered all too well. Then he found it. The last entry dated nearly a decade ago. The handwriting was frantic, spidery, the ink smudged as if by rain or tears. It described a disastrous, unauthorized assault on a small, neutral Apache settlement deep in the canyons. An ambush. The captain let us in. The sergeant wrote, "A trap. They were waiting. Fire from the cliffs. Men falling everywhere. A slaughter." The captain went down his horse shot from under him. He screamed for us to hold the line to fight. But the Lieutenant Callahan, I saw him. He turned his horse. He fled. He abandoned his commander, left him for dead. The coward ran. Reed dropped the journal as if it were on fire. His breath caught in his chest. Lieutenant Callahan. He stared at the words, the accusation burning itself into his mind. He remembered that day with horrifying clarity, the chaos, the screams, the sickening realization that Blackwood's arrogant charge had led them into a box canyon with no escape. But he hadn't run. He had been ordered to run. The company's grizzled first sergeant, a man who knew a lost cause when he saw one, had screamed at him to take what few men were left and break for the ridge to save them from being completely annihilated. The captain's gone son saved the rest. Reed had followed the order, his heart screaming in protest. The image of Blackwood disappearing under a wave of warriors seared into his memory forever. He had been listed as a survivor. Blackwood was listed as killed in action. But Blackwood hadn't died. The realization hit Reed with the force of a physical blow. Silas Blackwood had survived. And for all these years, he had believed Reed had abandoned him, a coward who had left him to die. It all clicked into place with sickening precision. Blackwood's unusual interest in his small, insignificant ranch. Jedediah Kane's friendly warning. The escalating pressure. It was never about the land. It was never about the water. It was about him. This was a vendetta carefully orchestrated over years. Blackwood wasn't trying to drive him off his land. He wanted to destroy him. He wanted to take everything from Reed, his land, his honor, his life, just as he believed Reed had taken everything from him. The fight for the ranch was merely the stage for a deeply personal, long-simmering revenge. This midpoint twist reframed everything. Reed wasn't a random bystander caught in a land grab. He was the primary target the ghost Blackwood had been hunting for a decade. The weight of this new reality was crushing. He looked around the small cabin at the three women sleeping in the loft, their breathing soft in the quiet night. He had brought them into the crosshairs of a personal war they knew nothing about. His past had finally caught up to him, and it was threatening to consume them all. The revelation changed the very air at the ranch. A new, heavier tension settled over Reed, and the women sensed it. He became more driven, more grimly focused, the knowledge of Blackwood's true motive, a constant gnawing presence. He now understood that simple defense would not be enough. Blackwood would not stop until Reed was utterly broken. The confirmation of this came with a cruelty that surpassed all previous escalations. Tala had found a small measure of peace in gathering herbs and wildflowers by the creek that bordered Reed's property. It was the one place where the quiet, watchful girl seemed to shed the weight of her trauma, her small hands moving deftly among the plants. It was her sanctuary. And Blackwood, with a predator's instinct for weakness, chose that sanctuary to strike. One afternoon she did not return. The descending sun cast the landscape in hues of orange and purple. But Tala's absence was a stark black hole in the calm evening. Newly found her gathering basket first lying on its side by the creek, a small clutch of freshly picked sagebrush spilled onto the dirt. A few yards away, Reed found the tracks 3 sets of shod horses, their prints gouged deep into the soft earth and the frantic scuffed marks of a struggle. A cold, sickening dread coiled in Reed's stomach. This was it. The second obstacle, the escalation he had been fearing. Tucked into the handle of the basket was a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The message was written in a clean, elegant script. Callahan, your sins have come home to roost. If you want to see the girl again, come to the old quarry at dawn, alone, or she pays for your cowardice. The words were a direct blow confirming the vendetta. Your cowardice. Blackwood was taunting him with the lie he had nursed for a decade. When he returned to the cabin and showed the note to Sion and Nolly, the room fell into a deathly silence. Nolly's face was a mask of cold fury, her hand gripping the hilt of a knife she had taken to wearing. Sion read the note, then looked at Reed, her dark eyes searching his face, seeing the torment he could no longer hide. What does he mean, your cowardice? She asked, her voice quiet but insistent. The time for secrets was over. Reed's shoulders slumped the weight of his past, finally breaking through his stoic reserve. He told them everything. About the army, about the Fort Verde campaign, about Captain Silas Blackwood and the disastrous ambush. He told them about the sergeant's journal and the lie that had festered for 10 years. He thinks I abandoned him. Reed finished, his voice raw. This isn't about you. It never was. He's been hunting me. He took Tala to force me into his trap. Nolly's fists were clenched. So you will go alone. You will walk into his ambush and leave us here. It's my fight, Reed said, the words tasting like ash. He wants me. If I go alone, he might let her live. No, Sayan, said, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. He took one of us. He did not kidnap your past, Reed. He kidnapped our future. Your fight became our fight the moment you opened your gate to us. She's right, Nolly added, her fiery gaze locking with his. You think we will sit here and wait while you sacrifice yourself for a ghost? We have lost our home, our family. We will not lose this. The trust he had so carefully built with them was now being put to the ultimate test. To go alone was to betray that trust, to treat them as baggage rather than partners. To bring them was to risk their lives in a battle that was at its heart his own. But looking at their determined faces, he knew there was no choice. They were a unit forged in shared labor and mutual defense. He could not and would not face this alone. The quarry is a death trap, he said, his mind already shifting from despair to strategy. Open ground, high walls. He'll have men on the ridges. Then we do not go in the way he expects. Sayan said, her mind just as sharp. She pointed to the crude map Reed had drawn in the dirt floor. Here, she said, her finger tracing a series of faint contour lines on the east side. The cliffs look sheer, but there will be paths. Ways for goat, for deer. Ways for us. A plan began to form, a desperate, dangerous strategy born from their combined strengths. Reed's knowledge of military tactics, Sayan's deep understanding of the land, and Nolly's fierce, pragmatic courage. They would not walk into Blackwood's trap. They would spring one of their own. As they prepared through the night, cleaning weapons and gathering supplies, the ranch was no longer a fortress protecting them from the world. It was a base of operations from which 4 determined souls would march out to reclaim one of their own and confront a tyrant. Dawn approached, not with a gentle blush, but with a malevolent, bruised, purple sky. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, the wind beginning to howl with a low, mournful cry, kicking up agitated swirls of dust. The environmental tension was a perfect mirror for the storm gathering in their hearts as they approached the old quarry. They left the horses tethered in a hidden ravine a mile away and proceeded on foot, moving with a silence that was part of the rising wind. The quarry was a gaping wound in the earth, a horseshoe of sheer rock walls dropping down to a flat, dusty floor. As Sayan had predicted, Blackwood's men were positioned on the ridges, silhouettes against the sickly dawn light. In the center of the quarry floor, Tala was tied to a thick iron stake, a small, defiant figure in the vast, intimidating space. Beside her stood Silas Blackwood, a man exuding an aura of absolute control. Reed's plan was desperate. He would be the bait. Sayan and Nolly, using the Apache tracking skills Sayan had taught them, would scale the treacherous eastern cliff face, hidden by the swirling dust and the deep morning shadows, to flank Blackwood's riflemen. Reed handed Nolly the revolver. "Don't fire until you have to," he whispered. "Create chaos. Draw their attention away from the floor." He then turned to Sayan, their eyes meeting in the dim light. No words were needed. A single sharp nod passed between them, an acknowledgement of the trust, the stakes, and the shared path that had led them to this precipice. Then they separated. The women vanished into the rocks like spirits, while Reed walked out into the open, his Winchester held loosely at his side, stepping into the arena alone. The wind whipped his coat around him, the stinging dust already reducing visibility, turning the world into a chaotic, disorienting vortex of grit and sound. Blackwood Reed's voice was a raw shout against the gale. "I'm here. Let the girl go." Blackwood turned a slow, theatrical movement. A triumphant, predatory smile spread across his handsome face. Callahan, I knew you wouldn't disappoint. The noble lieutenant come to atone for his sins. His voice amplified by the quarry's acoustics, dripped with years of venom. His men on the ridges shifted their rifles, all aimed at the lone figure below. The physical stakes were clear. Reed had to save Tala. But the emotional stakes were a churning tempest inside him. He had to confront the man who embodied his greatest failure, the living proof of a past he could never outrun. There were no sins, Blackwood Reed yelled back, taking another step forward. Only a bad order that got good men killed. Your order. Blackwood laughed, a harsh grating sound. My order was to fight. Your action was to flee, to abandon your commander and save your own skin. He took a step toward Tala, placing a hand on her shoulder. The girl flinched, but did not cry out. I've spent years imagining this moment, taking from you what you took from me, my life, my honor. Now I'll start with your little family. This was the moral stake to expose Blackwood's tyranny, not just to himself, but to the henchmen who followed him out of fear and greed. You're wrong, Reed said, his voice ringing with a conviction that cut through the wind. Your honor was already gone. You want to know what really happened that day? It was then that Blackwood delivered the final secondary twist, intending it as a killing blow to Reed's spirit. Oh, I know what happened. I led a righteous charge against savages who had been raiding our supply lines. A necessary action you were too lily-livered to see through. A gasp, sharp and sudden, came from the ridge above. It was not from Nolly. It was Scion. The pieces slammed together in her mind with brutal, devastating force. A neutral village. An unprovoked attack. The death of her husband, her father, her brothers. The stories of the survivors had described the officer who led the charge, a man with cold eyes and a cruel smile. A man who called them savages. Blackwood, hearing the sound, glanced up, momentarily distracted. It was the opening Reed needed. It wasn't a raid on hostiles. Blackwood Reed shouted, his voice now a roar of truth. It was an unauthorized, brutal attack on a peaceful village, women, children. I saw the reports you filed, the lies you told to justify a massacre. I didn't abandon you. I reported you for war crimes. The truth screamed into the swirling dust, hung in the air, more powerful than any bullet. Blackwood's face contorted, his charismatic mask shattering to reveal the monster beneath. Lies, he shrieked. But his men on the ridge hesitated. They had heard the conviction in Reed's voice, and now they heard a new voice, a woman's voice, crying out from the cliffs with pure, unadulterated grief and rage. He is the one, Scion screamed, her voice tearing through the wind. He is the butcher of Canyon Creek. The name, a legend of terror among her people, shattered the last vestiges of loyalty among Blackwood's men. They were hired guns, not participants in a madman's genocidal vendetta. Chaos erupted. Nolly fired the revolver, not at a man, but at a stack of loose rocks, sending a cascade of stone and dust down onto the riflemen below. They scrambled for cover, their attention completely diverted. In that instant, Reed lunged. He didn't fire his rifle. He used it as a club, knocking the pistol from Blackwood's hand. The two men crashed to the quarry floor, a whirlwind of fists and fury in the blinding sandstorm. Blackwood was strong, fueled by a decade of hate. But Reed was fighting for more than just revenge. He was fighting for redemption, for the family he had found, for the future Tala represented. He disarmed Blackwood not with a bullet, but by pinning him to the ground, the truth his final weapon. It's over. Reed gasped, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. Your lie is broken. They all know what you are. Blackwood looked past Reed, his eyes wild with disbelief. He saw his men on the ridge not aiming their rifles at Reed, but lowering them, turning away in disgust. He was alone, his power built on a foundation of lies, and fear crumbled to dust around him. He was powerless. The shootout had ended before it truly began, won not by superior firepower, but by the undeniable force of a long-buried truth. As the sandstorm began to subside, a new sound emerged from the dust, the thunder of approaching hooves. Blackwood's men, their loyalty shattered, abandoned their perches and fled into the wind-swept plains. Reed cut Tala free, and Sion and Nolly scrambled down the cliff face to join them. Just as they gathered, a posse from Redemption rode into the quarry, led by the town's sheriff, a man named Miller, his face a mixture of fear and newfound courage. He had finally been emboldened by the whispers and evidence Reed had fed him through the town clerk. Sheriff Miller looked from the exposed, defeated Blackwood to Reed's weary but resolute group. He cleared his throat, his voice finding a strength it hadn't possessed in years. "Silas Blackwood," he declared, pulling out a set of irons. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and murder." Blackwood didn't resist. He simply stared at Reed, his eyes empty, a man hollowed out by his own hatred. As Miller led him away, the disgraced Baron was no longer a charismatic tyrant, but a pathetic, broken figure. The ride home was quiet, a stark contrast to the howling chaos of the quarry. They brought a shaken but unharmed Tala back to the ranch. The exhaustion that settled over them was profound, bone-deep. They moved through the familiar motions of evening chores in a shared somber silence. Sion cleaned and dressed a cut on Reed's forehead. Reed helped Nolly reset her warning chimes, their purpose now feeling more protective than defensive. Tala, wrapped in a blanket by the fire, finally began to speak again, her voice a small, hesitant whisper as she described her ordeal. They tended to their wounds, both visible and invisible, the quiet acts of care a balm on their frayed souls. There was no celebration, no grand pronouncements of victory. There was only the immense quiet relief of survival, the deep sense of peace that comes after a terrible storm has passed. They had faced the ghosts of the past, and together they had won. A few weeks later, as the heat of summer began to yield to the softer touch of autumn, a buckboard rattled up the road to the ranch. A man in a city suit, looking thoroughly out of place, introduced himself as a traveling lawyer from the territorial capital. He carried a leather satchel and an air of formal importance. "Mr. Callahan," he asked, mopping his brow, "I've been sent on behalf of a consortium of your neighbors." Reed, flanked by Sion, Nolly, and Tala on the porch, regarded him with suspicion. But the lawyer smiled a genuine, unassuming expression. He opened his satchel and produced a sheaf of official-looking documents. "The town of Redemption owes you a debt," the lawyer explained. "With Blackwood's empire dismantled, the fraudulent deeds have been nullified. The townsfolk, led by Mr. Elias Thorne, pooled their resources. They want to ensure this valley remains in the hands of those who will protect it." He laid the papers on the porch railing. They were new deeds. One granted Reed Callahan full, indisputable ownership of his ranch. But there was another, far more surprising document. It was a deed for the adjacent plot of land, the one Blackwood had cleared the Apache encampment from, including its critical water rights. The deed was not made out to one person. Signed and witnessed by the townsfolk, it granted joint ownership of the land and its resources to Sion, Nolly, and Tala. "They wanted you to have a place to rebuild," the lawyer said softly. "A home that is legally and rightfully yours forever." The final surprise was not a cliffhanger, but a confirmation of their new beginning. It was a tangible promise, written in ink and sealed with the gratitude of a town set free. It secured their future, binding them, not just by bond, but by law, to this land they had fought for together. They were no longer guests or refugees. They were founders. Months later, the land was healing. Green shoots of winter wheat pushed through the soil where Reed had plowed new fields. The cabin had been expanded, a new wing added with sturdy timber and shared effort. The ranch was no longer a lonely outpost, but a thriving homestead. One crisp afternoon, Reed stood before his forge, the heat a familiar comfort. In his hands, he held the last relic of his old life, his Army-issue cavalry saber. It was a symbol of a past filled with violence, regret, and a war he could never truly win. With a deep cleansing breath, he thrust the steel into the glowing heart of the coals. Sion joined him, her presence a quiet support. She watched as he pulled the glowing, softened metal from the fire and laid it on the anvil. He handed her a second hammer, and together they began to work. The ringing of steel on steel was a new kind of music, a rhythm of creation, not destruction. They hammered the blade of war, folding and shaping it, their movements synchronized, until 4 sturdy gleaming plowshares lay cooling on the stone floor. They were not forgetting the past, but reforging it into a foundation for a shared future. That evening, a quiet peace settled over the cabin. Reed took Clara's small hawk-etched locket from the drawer where he had kept it hidden for so long. He walked to the mantelpiece above the hearth and gently placed it there. Beside it, he set the Apache silver locket that Sion Tona's daughter now wore openly around her neck, a symbol of heritage and survival. The 2 lockets from 2 different worlds rested side by side, their shared history of loss and love, finally at peace. He joined the others on the porch. They stood together, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over their fields. They were no longer 4 separate survivors, clinging to the wreckage of their lives. They were a family forged in fire and truth, their roots now firmly planted in the rich, dark soil of home.